Grandpa knew they were killing him. He could taste the poison in every pill my mother handed him with a loving smile every single morning. While she and my father were picking out new yachts, Grandpa was secretly gathering evidence of his own murder, knowing he wouldn't live to see the trial. When I opened his safe and saw the lab reports, I realized the people who raised me weren't parents, they were cold-blooded vultures. And today, I'm going to make them choke on their own lies. My name is Harper Sterling. I am 29 years old, and barely an hour has passed since I buried my grandfather in the damp, heavy soil of Port Haven. The funeral service had just concluded, leaving the air thick with the suffocating scent of lilies and salt spray. As I walked across the gravel lot of the small chapel, my fingers remained curled around a tiny brass key he had pressed into my palm 3 months ago. Holloway pinned against a mahogany bookshelf. His fist was bunched in the old man's collar, his voice a low. Back then, when his strength first began to fail, everyone dismissed it as the natural progression of age. Then, my phone vibrated in my pocket. An unknown number. Harper, it's Samuel, your grandfather's attorney and oldest friend. His voice was a brittle whisper on the other end, jagged with an unmistakable fear. I received a package he mailed the morning before he passed. Whatever is inside, it changes everything. Get to my office on Bay Street immediately. Come alone. Do not tell your parents, and for God's sake, do not tell Julian. I predatory growl. Give me the updated will, you old fool. Now. The lawyer's terrified gaze found mine across the room. The moment Julian spun toward me, Holloway shoved a thick, heavy envelope into my coat. Didn't ask questions. I drove. 10 minutes later, I pulled up to the weathered brick building near the docks. The office was draped in shadows, the front door standing slightly ajar and swaying rhythmically in the coastal breeze. Pocket and mouthed a single, frantic command. Run. The blood in my veins turned to ice. I pushed it open. The sight inside turned my blood to ice. My younger brother, Julian, had Samuel pinned against the mahogany bookshelves, his fist twisted tightly into the old man's collar. Give me the updated will, you old fool. Now. Julian's voice was a low, predatory growl I didn't recognize. Samuel's own brother was threatening the one man Silas had trusted above all others. Whatever they were desperate to keep hidden, they were willing to spill blood to ensure it stayed buried. I didn't wait to see if Julian would follow. I vanished. Terrified gaze met mine from across the room. The moment Julian turned to face me, the lawyer shoved a heavy manila envelope into the night. I bypassed the main roads and drove straight to the family estate at Sterling Point, my hands white, coat pocket, and mouthed a single word I will never forget. Run. I didn't wait. Fork-knuckled against the steering wheel. The sprawling house sat in total darkness, save for the pale glow of the porch light and explanation. My own flesh and blood was threatening the only man our grandfather had truly trusted in this world. Whatever secret my parents and Julian had supposedly returned here after the reception to rest. I parked 2 blocks away, killed the engine, were guarding, they were willing to spill blood to keep it in the dark. I fled the office and drove toward and waited until the final upstairs windows went black. Only then did I slip through the side gate and let myself in through the family estate on Magnolia Avenue, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel for the entire 6 mile. The kitchen entrance I'd left unlatched that morning. The slate floor was frigid beneath my feet as I climbed the stretch. My parents and Julian had supposedly gone home to rest after the reception, claiming exhaustion. The sprawling house sat in total darkness. Servant's staircase, careful to skip the 4th step that always groaned. I reached Silas's bedroom door, eased it open, save for a single amber light on the porch. I parked 2 blocks away under the hanging moss of an old oak, killed and locked it behind me. The room still held his scent, bay rum and old leather. I didn't dare the engine, and waited until the final window went black. Only then did I slip through the side gate and enter through the kitchen door I had intentionally left unlatched that morning. The marble tiles were freezing against my bare feet as I navigated the back staircase, use the overhead lights. I switched on the small amber lamp on his nightstand, the glow reflecting off the oil painting of his first, carefully avoiding the third step that always gave way with a telltale creak. My grandfather's bedroom door was shut tight. I eased it open, slipped inside, and turned the lock behind me. The familiar atmosphere hit me like merchant vessel. I lifted the canvas from the wall. The safe was exactly where he'd shown me years ago, a physical weight, the scent of old cedar, salt air, and his expensive tobacco. I didn't dare use the hidden behind the heavy frame. I inserted the brass key. The dial surrendered with a soft, heavy click. Inside lay a single manila envelope. I carried it to the bed, my heart thudding against my ribs, and broke the seal. The overhead light. I switched on the small reading lamp by his bed, its dim glow illuminating the slightly crooked oil painting of his first merchant vessel. I lifted the frame off the wall. The safe was exactly where he had shown me years ago. First page was covered in his distinctive, steady handwriting, dated 11 days before his death. My dearest Ren, back when he told me stories of hidden pirate treasures. I inserted the brass key and turned the dial. With a soft, mechanical click, the heavy door swung open. Inside sat a single, thick envelope. Nothing else. I carried it to the edge. The letter began. If you are reading this, I have run out of time. For nearly a year, someone in this house has been tampering with my medication. They replaced my heart tablets with a compound meant to destroy me by degrees. I noticed of his bed and broke the metal seal. The first page was a letter in his own handwriting, dated just 11 days before he died. My dearest Harper, if you are reading this, I did not survive. For nearly a year, someone within the bitterness first, then the vertigo, then the persistent, crushing weight in my chest. The page blurred. Before this house has been tampering with my heart medication, replacing my pills with a substance designed to slowly unravel me. I noticed my eyes. He had been feigning compliance, palming the pills they handed him every morning and night while seeking out a private specialist in Savannah under the guise of business meetings. The blood reports were attached, levels of digoxin toxicity 4 times above change in taste first, then the chronic vertigo, then the persistent, crushing pain in my chest that never quite subsided. I pretended to swallow what they handed me every morning and night. I palmed the tablets and made excuses to drive to a private specialist in the city under the guise of business meetings. The blood work confirmed my darkest fears, digoxin toxicity, 4 times the therapeutic limit. It was enough to stop the heart of a marathon runner, let alone an elderly man. Therapeutic limit. It was a dose meant to kill an elephant, let alone an old man of 83. I have saved the counterfeit tablets, he wrote. They are in the sealed bag behind this letter. 2 weeks ago, I met with a notary on the mainland and executed a final will. You are to inherit 78% of the sterling, one of the fraudulent bottles. It is in the plastic bag behind this letter. 2 weeks ago, I met with a notary on the mainland and executed a final will. You are to inherit 78% of the entire estate, the shipping empire. The fleet, the docks, the commercial holdings, and the private accounts, everything. Your parents are excluded entirely. I have discovered the predatory mortgages they took against the company behind my back. The letter detailed that Julian and Mila shipping fleet, the docks, the commercial holdings, and all liquid accounts. Everything. Your parents are to be excluded entirely. I discovered the predatory second mortgages they took against the firm without my consent. Julian and Margot are to receive 5% each in restricted trusts, no more. I wanted to confront them, but I feared they would simply finish the job sooner if they knew I were to receive only 5% each, held in a restrictive trust. Silas had been afraid to confront them, fearing they would simply accelerate their timeline if they knew he was onto them. So he had played the role of the dying patriarch while onto them. So I stayed silent and I planned. I am sorry to leave you with this burden, Harper. You were the only one who truly loved the sea as I did. Protect what remains. All my love, Arthur. I read the quietly stripping them of the prize they were killing him for. I am sorry to leave you to carry this burden. Words 3 times before they stopped blurring. Tucked behind the letter were 30 pages of ironclad legal documents, the notarized will, lab results from the municipal hospital, and the sealed evidence bag containing the counterfeit pills. Everything was signed, witnessed, and alone, he concluded. But you were the only one who ever truly loved the sea for what it was, and initialed in triplicate. I pressed the papers against my chest, feeling the room tilt on its axis. The same hands that had tucked me into bed when I was 5, the same voices that had sung to me every summer, they had not for the wealth it could yield. Protect the legacy. All my love, Silas. I read the words 3 times before I could breathe again. Beneath the letter were 30 pages of evidence, the notarized will, the lab reports been feeding him poison for a year, believing his death would hand them the keys to an empire. They never imagined he from the Savannah Medical Center, and the evidence bag containing the imitation pills. Everything was signed, witnessed, and ironclad. Was rewriting the rules of the game while they were busy counting the days until he was gone. I sat there. Oni pulled the documents to my chest and felt the world tilt. The very hands that had tucked me in as a child, his bed until the first gray hint of dawn began to bleed through the shutters, clutching the proof that the people sleeping downstairs were voices that had sung to me every summer, had been feeding him and poison for months. They had watched him wither, strangers wearing the faces of my family. The house had become a cage, and the air inside was thick with the scent of a long-planned murder. The people sleeping downstairs were strangers wearing the faces of my family. The sprawling estate had transformed into a gilded cage, every hallway a gauntlet of whispered threats and watching eyes. In the mornings, Robert would linger over his coffee, his gaze tracking me with a predatory stillness. "Any unusual phone calls lately, sweetheart?" he'd ask. His smile was a hollow thing that never quite reached his eyes. Margot was worse. She began preparing all the comfort foods of my childhood, standing over me as I ate, her eyes flicking toward my phone every time the screen flickered. And then there was Julian. He didn't bother with the pretenses. I would see his shadow stretched across the gap under my bedroom door long after the house had gone silent, a silent sentinel waiting for me to slip up. I stopped sleeping. I knew I had to get out, but I needed more than a letter. I needed the kind of proof that could survive a courtroom. I sent a coded message to Caleb. He was the only person left in my world who wasn't bought or compromised. We had been inseparable since our university days, and he now worked as an acoustics engineer for high-end venues in Portland. We met at a weathered coffee shop on the edge of the docks, the kind of place where the fog hides the faces of the patrons. I sat at a rusted table in the back and waited. Caleb arrived in a heavy dark hoodie, sliding into the seat opposite mine without a word. "Show me," he said. I slid my phone across the scarred wood. I had photographed every document from Silas's safe. Caleb scrolled through the images in a grim silence, his jaw tightening as he processed the lab reports and the handwritten letter. When he finally looked up, his expression was as cold as the Pacific. "They're taking the schooner out tonight for a memorial sail," Caleb whispered. "The whole family will be on the water for at least 5 hours. We go in at 9. We left our car 3 blocks away and cut through the coastal brush, staying in the shadows until we reached the stone perimeter of the estate. Caleb had a magnetic cloner for the security fobs. The side entrance to the garage clicked open in seconds. The air inside was heavy with the scent of marine fuel and expensive wax. We moved with a practiced, frantic efficiency. Caleb hit Robert's private study first. The mahogany desk was locked tight, but a thin blade and a bit of leverage took care of the drawer. Inside a file labeled Charity Donations, we found the smoking gun, bank transfer receipts from an offshore account in Margot's maiden name to a specialized pharmaceutical lab in Astoria. Each receipt was for a custom compound. No imprints. No markings. There were notes in my mother's elegant, flowing script. Increase dosage to 0.50 milligrams starting month 8. Ensure consistency in flavor. My stomach lurched. While I was at Caleb's side, he moved to the marble island in the kitchen where Julian had left his phone charging. Caleb plugged it into a compact laptop he pulled from his pack, running a bypass on the encryption software. He opened a group chat titled The Clearing. There were hundreds of messages. I felt the world tilt as I read them. Margot, he complained about the metallic taste again today. Julian told him it was a side effect of the new generic brand. He bought it. Robert, good. The lab confirmed this new batch should trigger a cardiac event within 6 weeks. Margot, once the coroner signs off, the trust funds are released. We're finally clear of the debt. Julian, $5.2 million in liquid assets by the end of the month. We can disappear if we need to. There was even a photo Robert had sent 2 weeks ago, a black duffel bag overflowing with stacks of $100 bills sitting on the office desk. The caption read, "Insurance policy." Caleb's face was ashen. He backed up the entire thread to an encrypted drive, and wiped every trace of our digital footprint. We slipped out of the house as silently as ghosts, locking the world of the Sterlings behind us. Standing under a flickering street lamp blocks away, Caleb handed me the drive. They really did it, he said, his voice barely audible. And they're already spending the money in their heads. They have no idea the money is already gone, I whispered, my fingers closing over the plastic. Caleb nodded. Then let's make sure they find out the hard way. He didn't want to risk the house's internal sensors again, so he waited until the perimeter lights cycled off. Dressed in dark gear and moving with the fluid grace of someone who didn't want to be found, he slipped back toward the driveway. I watched from the shadows as he disappeared beneath Julian's heavy black truck. In less than a minute, he had secured a military-grade, voice-activated recorder to the frame rail. It was a small, unassuming piece of hardware with a 48-hour battery and a high-gain microphone. He was back at my side before the next patrol car passed the estate gates. We were no longer just victims, we were the ones setting the trap. We moved the car a block away, tucking it under the heavy, drooping branches of a weeping willow on Oak Street. We killed the engine, the world outside turning into a blur of charcoal shadows, and pressed the wireless earpieces into place. The feed crackled to life instantly, first the rush of the coastal wind, then the low, guttural thrum of the truck turning into the estate's long driveway. At nearly midnight, the vehicle rumbled through the iron gates. We sat in a silence so thick it felt physical. The recorder caught every detail, the heavy thud of doors, the crunch of gravel beneath 3 sets of boots, the metallic clatter of the tailgate being dropped. Then, the voices began. They were unguarded, loud with the arrogance of people who believed their walls were thick enough to hide their sins. Margot spoke first, the sharp, rhythmic click of her heels echoing off the garage's concrete floor. She's been acting strange ever since she met with Holloway. I found her phone on the counter earlier this afternoon. She'd wiped the call logs, but I recognized the office prefix. Robert's reply was smooth, the sound of liquid splashing into a glass followed by the distinct clink of ice. Let her delete whatever she wants. The death certificate is already filed. Congestive heart failure brought on by chronic arrhythmia. It's signed, sealed, and sitting in the courthouse database. 10 business days, and the probate judge releases the liquid assets. Julian snorted, his keys jangling as he tossed them onto a metal workbench. She thinks she's so clever. Always did. Grandpa let her pilot the cutters when she was still in braids. Flew her to every maritime show from Charleston to Seattle, while I was stuck here scraping barnacles off hulls for pocket money. He never even looked at me. That's why we started the switch nearly a year ago, Margot said, her voice dropping to a softer, almost prideful tone. Slow and steady. Impossible to trace. The lab in Astoria even stripped the imprints so the pills looked identical. He never suspected his own blood. Robert cut in, his voice a low, lethal whisper. $5 million hits the primary account the moment probate clears. We settle the bank, liquidate the fleet to the highest bidder, and we're on a flight south before the ink is dry. Harper gets whatever scraps the creditors leave behind. Which, by my count, will be nothing. There was a brief pause, the sound of more ice rattling. Julian laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. She'll be standing there with that pathetic, mourning face while we sipping drinks on a private beach she'll never see. The old man's little princess is finally going to learn what the real world costs. Stop gloating and go to bed, Margot commanded, her heels clicking toward the interior door. We have the memorial toast tomorrow night. Try to look like a grieving grandson. The heavy door slammed shut. Silence returned to the feed, save for the distant, rhythmic chirping of crickets. Caleb pulled his earpiece out slowly, his eyes fixed on the darkened silhouette of the house. They just handed us the entire case on a silver platter, he said quietly. GPS locked, time-stamped, and 3 voices confessing to a premeditated murder. I stared at my hands, which were shaking uncontrollably. They had toasted to my grandfather's death, as if they were closing a simple real estate deal. Caleb started the engine. Now, let's make sure that deal falls through. The morning of the formal will reading arrived with a stifling, humid heat. Heritage Trust had reserved their largest boardroom on the 2nd floor, a glass-walled space overlooking the harbor. It was packed. At least 70 people filled the rows, distant cousins I hadn't seen in years, captains who had sailed Silas's ships since the 70s, and local reporters who had caught the scent of a brewing scandal. Even the county medical examiner sat in the back row, looking somber. My parents and Julian took the front row, dressed as if they were attending a coronation rather than a reading. Margot was draped in pearls, Robert wore a tailored navy blazer with the family crest pinned to the lapel, Julian refused to remove his dark sunglasses, leaning back with a smug, bored expression. They accepted condolences with practiced, hollow grace. I sat 3 rows back, Caleb beside me in a borrowed suit, his laptop bag resting at his feet. Samuel Halloway stood at the mahogany podium, looking 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. His hands trembled as he opened the leather folio. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the hushed room. Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here for the reading of the last will and testament of Silas Sterling, executed and notarized exactly 14 days prior to his passing. He began with the standard legal jargon, his voice gaining strength as he reached the dispositive provisions. Article 7. To my son, Robert Sterling, and his wife, Margot, I leave the sum of $1 each, in recognition of the substantial gifts already bestowed, and the unauthorized liabilities they have incurred against the family holdings without my consent. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Robert half rose from his chair, his face flushing a violent shade of crimson. Article 8. To my grandson Julian and my granddaughter Beatrice, I leave 5% of the residue each, to be held in restrictive trust until they reach the age of 35. Julian ripped off his sunglasses, his mouth hanging open in shock. Article 9. The remaining 78% of my estate, including the shipping fleet, the docks, all commercial property, and private accounts, I bequeath in its entirety to my granddaughter, Harper Marie Sterling. Before the chaos could erupt, the massive projector screen behind Samuel flared to life. Caleb had already bypassed the building's internal network, seizing control of the AV system. The lights dimmed automatically, and the room was suddenly filled with Margot's voice, recorded only nights before. She's been acting strange ever since the lawyer thing. Then Robert, 5 million hits the account the moment probate clears. We liquidate the fleet and disappear. Then Julian's cold, mocking laughter, she'll be standing there with that pathetic face while we're on a beach she'll never see. One by one, the group chat logs began to scroll across the screen, every text, every timestamp, every cold-blooded calculation. It ended with the photo of the duffel bag stuffed with cash. The room exploded. Reporters scrambled for position, phones were raised like a forest of black mirrors, and 2 uniformed deputies began moving toward the front row. Robert was screaming at Samuel, pointing a shaking finger, but the sound was drowned out by the recorded evidence of his own betrayal. Reporters scrambled for position, some standing on chairs to get a better angle. A sea of smartphones rose like a wall of black mirrors between me and my family. 2 uniformed deputies began closing in on the front row. My father was on his feet, his face a mask of fury as he pointed a trembling finger at Samuel. "This is a sham," he bellowed. "That will was signed under duress. It's a forgery." Julian didn't shout. He bolted. He shoved his way past knees and designer handbags, his eyes fixed on me with a terrifying, singular intensity. "You did this. You lying little." Security intercepted him 6 feet from my chair. He thrashed in their grip as my mother collapsed into the aisle. Her string of pearls snapped, the white orbs scattering across the carpet like teeth. She was sobbing, a broken, jagged sound. "We only wanted what was ours." Samuel didn't flinch. He waited for the noise to subside just enough to read the final clause, written in Silas's own jagged script. "And to anyone who contests this will, I leave nothing. I direct my executor to defend this legacy with every dollar in the estate." The screen looped the recording again, the volume high enough to rattle the windows. The deputies clicked handcuffs into place, securing my father, my mother, and my brother in front of a dozen cameras. Julian screamed my name until his voice cracked, the veins in his neck bulging. I stayed in my seat until the room finally emptied. The weight of 78% of the sterling empire now rested on my shoulders, shadowed by the knowledge that the people who raised me valued a bank balance more than a life. The reading was front-page news by dusk. My parents and Julian were released on signature bonds that same afternoon. The state attorney needed time to finalize the capital murder charges. They walked out of the courthouse with their heads held high, smiling for the flashes, claiming the audio was a deep fake, and the will was a product of coercion. They went straight back to the estate and packed. By midnight, the fastest vessel in our fleet, a 65-foot sport fisher named the Last Dividend, was gone from its slip. The Coast Guard tracked its signal heading southeast at 38 knots. Destination, the Caribbean. Anywhere without an extradition treaty. They never saw the trap. I had contacted the FBI's regional field office the night Caleb pulled the data. Special Agent Sarah Miller had been meticulous. She listened to the files and asked a single, pointed question. "Can you get them to discuss the money one more time on American soil?" I told her I could. Caleb spoofed a message from Bennett Crawford, Silas's former CFO, who had already turned state's evidence and was in protective custody. The text was simple. "The cash is ready. 5.2 million wired offshore, but I need a physical signature to release the hold. Pier 19. 4 a.m. Come alone or the deal is dead." My father replied in less than 2 minutes. "On our way." Pier 19 sat at the end of a private peninsula owned by the company. It was gated, isolated, and lit only by the eerie orange glow of sodium security lamps. Agent Miller had 6 plainclothes officers tucked behind shipping containers and rusted pilings. Caleb and I watched from a shrimp boat 2 slips over, night vision binoculars pressed to our eyes. At 3:57 a.m., the sport fisher eased toward the dock, its running lights dark, the engines throttled down to a ghostly whisper. My father killed the diesels and threw the lines. All 3 of them stepped onto the wood, carrying heavy duffels and a single rolling suitcase. Julian scanned the darkness with a high-powered tactical light. My mother clutched her handbag like a life preserver. Bennett Crawford's voice, a pre-recorded lure projected from the shadows near the fuel pumps, echoed through the salt air. "Over here. The money is in the office." They walked straight into the kill box. My father's voice rang out, hollow against the metal containers. "It's all there. 5.2 in hundreds. We need to be clear of the coast by sunrise." The hidden agent responded with Bennett's exact cadence. "Everything is inside. Let's move." Julian dropped his bag and stretched, a smug grin visible even in the dark. "Once we're past the reef, Harper can have the ruins. She'll be lucky to keep a single leaky skiff. My mother let out a nervous, sharp laugh. She always thought she was special. It's time she learned how the world actually works. My father set the suitcase on the pier and popped the latches. It was filled with stacks of blank paper, topped with a few genuine bills, a classic sting prop. Let's count it and go. In that heartbeat, the floodlights snapped on, blindingly white. 12 agents in tactical jackets stepped from the shadows, weapons drawn. Federal agents. Hands in the air. Margot screamed. Julian spun around, looking for an escape that had been cut off an hour ago. My father stood frozen, his mouth agape. Miller stepped forward, reading from a laminated card. Robert Sterling. Margot Sterling. Julian Sterling. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, wire fraud, and interstate flight to avoid prosecution. You have the right to remain silent, Miller continued. Julian lunged for the boat rail, a desperate, animalistic move. 2 agents tackled him instantly, driving him face-first into the teak deck. My mother collapsed to her knees, sobbing and clutching at Julian's shirt. Don't say anything, baby. Don't say a word. My father just stared at the stacks of paper, the realization finally sinking in. He changed it, he whispered. He actually changed everything. The handcuffs clicked. The duffels were bagged as evidence of their intent to flee. Julian, blood blooming on his lip from the impact with the deck, looked toward the shrimp boat. He saw me standing there, silhouetted against the harbor lights. You set us up, he spat. I didn't answer him. I didn't have to. The microphones hidden along the dock had captured every syllable of his malice with crystalline precision. By the time the sun began to bleed over the Atlantic horizon, the last dividend had been impounded by federal marshals. The 3 of them were already locked in a transport van bound for the regional detention center. The story broke on every major network before the morning mist had cleared from the harbor. They never made it to international waters, and they never touched a single cent of the fortune they had killed for. The federal courthouse rose like a limestone fortress against the sweltering August sky. Inside courtroom 4B, the industrial hum of the air conditioning couldn't quite mask the heavy tension of the proceedings. Jury selection had taken 4 grueling days. Every potential juror was asked if they had ever lost a loved one to a long illness, and whether the shadow of greed had ever fractured their own family. 3 were dismissed on the spot simply because they couldn't stop weeping. Opening statements began on a humid Monday morning. The lead prosecutor, Vivian Thorne, stood before the jury in a sharp charcoal suit. She spoke without a single note, her voice steady and lethal. She told the 12 strangers that this wasn't a mystery, it was a chronicle of cold, calculated cruelty. She laid out the timeline with clinical detail, 11 months of swapped medication and forged laboratory orders. She showed them the celebratory texts, messages about liquid assets and beachfront properties they believed were already theirs. The defense, a trio of high-priced attorneys, tried to spin a story of tragic misunderstanding and elderly paranoia. They projected childhood photos of me on the decks of the fleet with Silas, claiming I had manipulated a fading, confused man for his millions. The jury remained stone-faced. I was the first witness called to the stand. Vivian walked me through every piece of evidence with agonizing slowness. The letter from the safe, the toxicology reports, the receipts from the lab in Astoria, the group chats, and the recording from the garage. When the audio finally played, the sound of my parents laughing about natural causes, while Silas was still breathing, the courtroom fell into a silence so profound it felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. My cross-examination lasted 3 hours. The lead defense lawyer tried to rattle me, asking if I felt a sense of triumph in my sudden wealth. I looked him in the eye and told him I only felt a crushing guilt that the people who raised me had valued a bank balance more than a human life. Robert took the stand next. He wore a suit that was 2 sizes too large for his gaunt frame, the orange of his prison scrubs visible at the collar. He claimed Silas had been suffering from sundowning dementia, and that I had coerced him into signing the new will during a private visit. Vivian dismantled him in minutes, presenting the notary's testimony and hospital logs that proved I was never alone with my grandfather in the weeks before the documents were finalized. Margot sobbed through her entire testimony, her makeup running in dark streaks, insisting she only wanted to protect the family firm from bankruptcy. But the jury had already heard her on the doc recording, mocking the idea of me inheriting even a leaky skiff, and they weren't buying the tears. Julian refused to testify. His lawyers tried to suppress the recordings as illegal wiretaps, but Judge Henderson denied the motion in a scathing 20-page order, citing the urgency of the crime and the grandfather's own recorded consent. Closing arguments lasted a single day. Vivian ended her statement with a photograph projected on the massive screens, Silas and me on the bridge of his favorite cutter, both of us sunburnt and laughing. "They murdered him for a legacy they never earned and never deserved," she said softly. "Make sure they never profit from his death." The jury deliberated for exactly 4 hours and 12 minutes. Guilty on every count. First-degree murder for financial gain. Conspiracy. Aggravated manslaughter of an elder. Wire fraud and money laundering. Because the state had declined to seek the death penalty, the law mandated only one possible outcome. Judge Henderson looked at each of them in turn as she delivered the sentence. Robert, Margot, and Julian, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Beatrice sat in the very back row. She had been granted immunity for her testimony, admitting she had overheard the plan, but had been too afraid to report it. The judge was not moved. He revoked her 5% trust in its entirety, redirecting every cent to a restitution fund for victims of elder abuse. As the marshals stepped forward to click the cuffs into place, Julian turned to look at me. For a fleeting second, the mask of hatred slipped, and I saw a flicker of raw, naked terror. Then the mask slammed back down. He mouthed a single, silent word I didn't need to hear to understand. I stood, smoothed my skirt, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind me with a thud that felt like the closing of a tomb. 2 years later, I stood alone at Silas's grave on a quiet Thursday morning. The air was thick with the scent of salt and jasmine. The headstone was simple gray granite, Silas Sterling. 1941 to 2024. Guardian of the Sea. I laid a bouquet of sunflowers at the base. They were his favorite. A year ago, I had legally changed my name to Laura Marie Hart, taking my grandmother's maiden name. The court clerk hadn't even blinked, the paperwork was finalized the same week the prison sentences became official. The Sterling name, the one they had been so willing to kill for, no longer belonged to me. The fleet still sails. 42 vessels in all. But the culture has changed. Every captain is on a fair salary now, every crew member has health insurance, and every cent of profit above the operating costs goes into the Silas Sterling Medical Scholarship. We've already awarded 58 full-ride scholarships to students studying cardiology or geriatrics, kids who grew up with nothing but the drive to save lives. I read every single application myself. Beatrice reached out once, 6 months after the sentencing, asking if she could have a memento of our grandfather. I sent her a single postcard of the cemetery with a sentence written on the back, "You already have your memories." She never wrote again. Caleb moved to the city to work in acoustics, but he flies down every spring for the scholarship ceremony. We drink coffee on the pier at sunrise and watch the fog lift off the water. Sometimes tourists ask why the largest shipping firm on the coast is run by a woman who doesn't put her name on the signs. I tell them the truth. The men who built this empire wanted the ocean to stay open to everyone, not locked behind a wall of greed. I brushed a bit of dust from the granite stone and spoke the words I had carried for 2 years. I kept my promise, Grandpa. Not a single penny of yours ever reached their hands. The ships are steady, and every student we put through school carries your name on their degree. They'll save the lives you never got to live. I stood up and walked down the shell-lined path toward the gate. The sun was warm on my face, the same sun that had warmed him every morning he spent on the water. Family isn't always about the blood in your veins. Sometimes it's about the promises you keep when everyone else is looking for a way to break them. Justice isn't always a roar. Sometimes it's a quiet, steady tide. And the greatest inheritance isn't the money at all, it's knowing you were the one who chose the truth, when a lie would have been so much easier. The Sterling name no longer belonged to me. The fleet, 42 vessels strong, still cuts through the coastal waters, but the heart of the operation has fundamentally changed. Every captain is now on a steady salary. Every deckhand has comprehensive health insurance. The predatory greed that once fueled the boardroom has been replaced by the Silas Sterling Medical Foundation. Every cent of profit beyond the operating costs is channeled directly into scholarships for students who want to heal. We have already awarded 58 full rides to first-generation medical students, kids who grew up on the docks or in rural backwaters, who faced every hardship but still managed to ace their entrance exams. They study cardiology or geriatrics, focusing on the very things that were stolen from my grandfather. I personally review every application that crosses my desk. Beatrice, the sister who stood by and watched the poison take hold, reached out once. It was 6 months after the sentencing, and she asked if she could have a memento to remember Silas by. I didn't send her a family heirloom. I sent her a single postcard of the cemetery with a short note on the back. You already have your memories. She never wrote again. Caleb moved to the city to work in acoustics, but he makes the trip back every February for the Foundation's annual ceremony. We sit on the edge of the pier at sunrise, drinking dark roast from a thermos, and we never mention the trial. Sometimes tourists wander onto the docks, curious why the largest charter firm on the coast is managed by a woman in her late 20s who refuses to put a family name on the signage. I tell them the truth. The men who built this legacy wanted the sea to be open to everyone, not a trophy locked away by greed. During my last visit to the cemetery, I knelt by the gray granite stone, brushing away a stray bit of salt and sand. I kept my promise, Silas, I whispered. Not a single penny of yours ever reached their hands. The company is healthy, the ships are steady, and every student we put through school carries your name on their degree. They will save the lives you never got to live. I stood up and turned my back to the grave, walking down the shell-lined path toward the gate. The sun was warm on my face, the same sun that had warmed my grandfather every morning he spent on the water. Blood only makes you a relative, the promises you keep are what make you family. Justice isn't always a spectacle. Sometimes it's just the quiet, heavy click of a door closing for good. And the greatest inheritance isn't the gold or the fleet, it's the peace that comes from being the one who chose the truth when a lie would have been so much easier.